Okay, Acts chapter 17. Now, in chapter 16, we left off sort of up here in the region of Philippi where Paul met Lydia. And so then what we're going to see is it says that they traveled through these towns and came to Thessalonica, and there was a Jewish synagogue there. Okay, so he goes from Philippi over here to Thessalonica. And by the way, if you look at our reading plan, we're just what in the next few days we're going to finish up Acts 16 through 20, and then we're going to get into the letters, the two letters to the Thessalonians. So keep that in mind because you're going to be reading a little bit about what Paul's saying back to those churches in in Thessalonica. But right now we're going to read about how he met them and when he first visited them. And it says that he went into a synagogue and taught scriptures and reasoned with them in the synagogue. So notice at this point, he's still allowed into the synagogues. So Christianity was still sort of inside the synagogues also to an extent. It's not going to remain like that forever, but at this point it still is. He explains to them that Jesus is the Messiah. Okay, so it says in verse 4, some of the Jews who listened were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with many God-fearing Greek men and quite a few prominent women. But then it also says, and you can read this, that other Jews were jealous, and so there's a real division. You know, what Paul is preaching, a lot of the people didn't really agree with, so they drove them out, and you can read about how that all happened, and so then they are forced to leave and they end up in Berea. Okay, so they leave Thessalonica and they end up over here in Berea. And it says that that night in Berea, they went to the synagogue once again. The people in Berea were more open-minded and they listened eagerly to Paul's message and they searched the scriptures day after day. And they mean by that the Old Testament because they didn't have the New Testament yet. So they searched the scriptures day by day to see if Paul and Silas were teaching the truth. I think that's a great example for us. The Bereans are a great example. The Thessalonians, a lot of them didn't receive the message, even though some of them did. But the Bereans received it, but they really looked into the Old Testament and confirmed that what Paul was saying was indeed true. And it says many Jews believed, but then some of the troublemakers from Thessalonica caught up to them in Berea, and so then Paul had to leave for Athens. Okay, so back to the map. Paul goes from Berea, and he ends up by boat going down here to Athens. And it says in verse 16, while Paul was waiting for his companions in Athens, he was deeply troubled by all the idols that he saw everywhere in the city. Okay, so this is in Greece, and so this is of course where there is just a huge contingent of Gentiles and not a very Jewish area. But he did go to the synagogue and reason with the Jews and with the God-fearing Gentiles, which means the Gentiles who believed in the God of the Old Testament. And he spoke daily in the public square to anyone who happened to be there. Okay, so he's preaching to Jews, but then he's also preaching in the public square to just anyone, which would include, the Greeks and the Romans. Okay, so it says that he debated with them, and you can read this, but it's interesting. He ends up standing before the council, and he addressed them like this: men of Athens. And so now he's out in this open air market. He's in there mixing in with all the philosophers, and he's trying to explain to them, not to the people in the synagogue, but to the people in the public square. He's trying to explain the gospel to them. And notice how he does it a little differently. He says, I noticed that you're very religious. I was walking along. I saw many of your shrines. And on one of your altars, you had this inscription, to an unknown God. And so that's, they had all these, Greek and Roman gods, but they had one there, to an unknown God. And Paul used that as as a springboard to describe and explain the God of the Bible. He says, this God whom you worship without knowing is the one I'm telling you about. And you can read now what he says to them. And just notice how different it is than how he preached or how Peter preached to the Jews, because he's got to contextualize the message of the gospel. That's something we still have to do. We have to know who we're talking to, and we have to explain it to them in a way that they can understand. That's exactly what Paul does here. I'll let you read that for yourself, and that'll bring you to the end of Acts chapter 17. So go ahead and read that now, and then I will see you tomorrow for Acts chapter 18.